A humble woman attends a gala surrounded by millionaires who despise her. But when her true identity is revealed, everyone is left speechless, and her greatest critic kneels before her. Clara had always led a simple life. From a young age, she had felt a calling to help others, devoting her time and effort to social causes in her community. Her day-to-day life was filled with tasks that, while humble, had a profound impact on the people around her. Her kind nature and generous spirit had made her a beloved figure among her neighbors, although Clara preferred to stay out of the spotlight. One afternoon, as Clara was preparing food boxes for a family in need, her concentration was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Opening the door, she found an elegant envelope with her name written in gold calligraphy. Intrigued, she carefully opened it. Inside, an invitation detailed a gala event hosted by a renowned charity. Clara read the words over and over again, wondering if it was a mistake. That night, sitting at the small table in her kitchen, Clara shared the news with Julia, her best friend and confidant. "It's absurd, Julia. I don't belong to those circles. Surely there are people more suitable to attend." "Why do you say that?" Julia replied, taking a sip of her tea. "Clara, you work tirelessly for others. If anyone deserves to be there, it's you." Clara shook her head uneasily. The idea of being surrounded by elite people was overwhelming. "I wouldn't feel comfortable," she admitted. "Besides, what would I gain by going?" Julia smiled tenderly. "It's not always about what we win, Clara. Maybe this is a chance for something bigger. Sometimes fate takes us to unexpected places for a reason." Her friend's words echoed in her mind long after Julia had said goodbye that night. As Clara closed the curtains on her window, she couldn't stop thinking about the invitation on the table. Something in her, a vague but persistent intuition, told her she should attend. However, a shadow of doubt continued to weigh on her decision. Finally, with a deep sigh, Clara took the envelope and placed it in her bag. Although she was still not completely convinced, she decided to take the first step. After all, as Julia used to say, sometimes the biggest change starts with a small act of courage. The evening of the event arrived quicker than Clara expected. Dressed in a simple but elegant blue dress that Julia had lent her, she walked unsteadily toward the entrance of the luxurious hotel where the gala was to be held. The lights shone brightly, and a red carpet stretched from the sidewalk to the imposing main doors. Clara felt the weight of the gazes surrounding her as she walked forward. Some guests, in dazzling suits and dresses, watched her from the corner of their eyes, exchanging comments in low voices. Although she tried to keep her head high, she couldn't help but feel that she didn't fit in there. As she walked through the glass doors, the interior of the hotel took her breath away. The ballroom was decorated with golden chandeliers, tables covered with silk tablecloths, and floral arrangements that exuded opulence. Clara paused for a moment to take a deep breath and calm her nerves. "Good evening, miss," said a receptionist with a polite smile as he handed her a card with her table number. "Welcome to the event." Clara nodded her thanks and walked towards the main room. Meanwhile, in a nearby corner, a tall man with a distinguished bearing and cold gaze was watching her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. It was Henrique, a businessman known not only for his wealth, but also for his haughty character and his sharp skepticism towards those he considered out of place. "Who is she?" he asked one of his colleagues, not hiding the critical tone in his voice. "I don't know, but it seems different, don't you think?" The other replied, trying not to sound too contemptuous. Henrique gave a sarcastic smile. "He's definitely not in his element." As Clara walked to her table, she felt the stares continue to follow her, accompanied by murmurs that she could barely ignore. She sat down carefully, trying not to draw more attention than necessary. As she watched the waiters gracefully move between the tables, Clara couldn't help but reflect on her decision to attend. Julia had encouraged her, but now, surrounded by so much luxury, she wondered if she had really done the right thing. Yet something in the air, perhaps an intuition like the one she had felt when she received the invitation, told her that tonight was going to be different. From his spot, Henrique continued to watch her, intrigued but also annoyed. In his mind, someone like Clara had no place at such an exclusive event. What he didn't know yet was that seemingly insignificant encounter would change the course of their lives forever. The evening progressed with speeches and toasts that filled the room with carefully rehearsed formality. Clara, sitting at her table, listened intently as the presenters talked about the foundation's achievements. Although she tried to remain unnoticed, she couldn't ignore the glances and whispered comments that seemed to be directed at her. Henrique, for his part, remained the center of attention as usual. With a glass of wine in his hand, he chatted animatedly with other guests, but from time to time when his gaze shifted to Clara, something about her unnerved him. Maybe it was her calm demeanor in a place that was clearly not her usual environment, or maybe it was simple curiosity that arose from not being able to place her in the social scheme he knew so well. Finally, during a pause in the speeches, Enrique could not contain himself any longer. Raising his glass, he addressed the audience with a smile that did not hide his irony. "I find it fascinating how this gala brings together people from such different backgrounds," he said, raising his voice slightly to make sure everyone could hear him. "Some of us come here as benefactors, others as representatives of great projects. And well, some just seem lost." The comment elicited discreet laughter from several attendees, and gazes turned to Clara again. Although she didn't mention her name, the message was clear. Clara felt an uncomfortable heat rise in her face, but she refused to lower her head. Instead, she stood calmly, drawing even more of the room's attention. "That's true, sir," he replied in a firm but calm voice. "This gala brings together very different people, and I think that's what makes it special. Each one brings something different, whether it's resources, ideas, or simply the willingness to be here to listen." Her dignified response left the room in a brief but heavy silence. Henrique raised an eyebrow, surprised by Clara's bravery. However, his pride did not allow him to back down. "Interesting perspective," he said with a cold smile. "But I wonder, what exactly do you bring to the table?" Before Clara could respond, Julia, who had been watching the scene with growing concern, quickly rose from her seat. "Clara doesn't need to justify her presence here," he intervened, looking at Henrique sternly. "The purpose of this gala is to unite us, not divide us." Henrique seemed about to retort, but at that moment, one of the organizers came up on stage to continue with the program, interrupting the tension in the room. Clara took advantage of the distraction to sit down again, although she could still feel the stares fixed on her back. As the event continued, Clara took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. She knew she had done the right thing by responding with dignity, but she couldn't deny that the experience had left her uneasy. Henrique, for his part, couldn't take his eyes off her, his mind racing in search of an explanation for the calm and strength he had just witnessed. Clara remained in her place, trying to concentrate on the words of the presenter, who was now taking the stage again, but the weight of the gazes continued on her. Despite her initial strength, she was beginning to feel the emotional fatigue of the situation. Every murmur, every suppressed smile around her felt like a reminder that, for many, she did not belong there. Henrique, sitting across the room, couldn't take his eyes off Clara. Although she kept her relaxed attitude on the outside, inside he was overcome with a growing uneasiness. What was that woman doing here? He asked himself. He couldn't help but notice her dignified posture despite the whispers, something that disconcerted him as much as it irritated him. At one point, as the waiters began serving the main course, Henrique made a comment loud enough for those closest to him to hear. "It seems that some confuse charity with misdirected compassion." The discreet laughter of her companions only increased Clara's discomfort. Although she pretended not to hear it, her chest tightened with a mixture of sadness and frustration. She looked at her plate, almost unable to eat, while Enrique's voice continued to echo in her mind. The organizers, from a corner of the room, watched in silence. There was something in the way they exchanged glances that seemed more like calculated anticipation than concern. Clara wasn't aware of it, but that glint in their eyes suggested they knew exactly what they were doing. Julia, sitting next to Clara, tried to distract her with conversation, but it was obvious that her friend was deeply affected. "Clara, don't give them the pleasure of seeing you down," Julia whispered, taking her hand. "They don't know what you know, nor have they lived what you have lived." Clara nodded weakly, but Julia's words barely managed to calm the whirlwind of emotions that was overwhelming her. She wondered if it had been a mistake to accept the invitation. Perhaps her place was in her community, far from a world that seemed so superficial and hostile. Yet despite her doubts, something inside her refused to give up. She had learned that even in the most difficult times, dignity and determination could be her best allies. She decided to stand firm, even though deep inside she felt like she was at the edge of her limits. Meanwhile, Enrique continued to make caustic comments, unaware that his insistence was beginning to attract the attention of other guests. Some seemed amused, but others looked on with disapproval. Clara, unwittingly, was beginning to gain silent allies. The rest of the dinner was held in a tense balance. Clara remained where she was, determined not to give in to the provocations. Enrique, unable to understand the reason for her discomfort toward this woman, sank further into his arrogance. And the organizers, always watching from the shadows, seemed to be patiently waiting for the perfect moment to act. During a brief pause in the event, attendees dispersed to enjoy a coffee or a glass of wine in designated areas. Clara took advantage of the moment to discreetly retreat to a quieter corner. She needed a respite from the stifling atmosphere of the main hall. As she watched from afar as lively conversations filled the space, a kind-looking middle-aged man, one of the event organizers, approached her. He wore a serene smile, as if he had been looking forward to this encounter. "Miss Clara," he greeted her politely, "are you finding the evening interesting?" Clara nodded with a faint smile. "It is an impressive event, no doubt, although I must admit I am not used to this type of meeting." The man looked at her with a mixture of respect and enthusiasm. "We understand that this experience can be somewhat overwhelming. However, I assure you that your presence here is more important than you can imagine." The man's answer intrigued Clara, but before she could ask, he continued, "Please be patient. The true purpose of this evening will soon be revealed. We thank you for accepting our invitation, even if it meant stepping out of your comfort zone." Clara didn't know what to say. The organizer's words raised more questions than answers, but his sincere tone managed to calm some of her anxiety. "Thank you for saying that," she finally said. "I'm not sure what lies ahead, but I'll do my best." The man gave her one last smile before walking away, leaving her lost in her thoughts. In the distance, Clara saw Julia gesturing to her from her table, probably trying to make sure she was okay. She decided to head back before raising suspicions. Meanwhile, in another part of the room, Enrique continued to converse with his business colleagues, although his mind could not get away from Clara. His pride prevented him from admitting it, but something about her had captured his attention in a way he could not understand. Why so much interest in someone who clearly doesn't belong here? One of his friends asked him with a mocking smile. Enrique, annoyed by the comment, shrugged his shoulders. "It's just curiosity. Although, to be honest, I wonder what purpose someone like her has in an event like this." The air of superiority in her tone was unmistakable, but behind her words there was a doubt that was beginning to unsettle him. Enrique was used to reading people with ease, but Clara represented an enigma that his arrogance could not decipher. Back in her seat, Clara noticed the organizers exchanging glances and restrained smiles as they finalized details on stage. The excitement in the air was growing, although most of the guests didn't seem to notice. Clara took a sip of water, trying to prepare herself for whatever was to come. Something inside her told her that tonight still held surprises that would change the course of everything. The hum of conversation stopped as the lights in the room dimmed. An organizer took the microphone on the main stage, capturing the attention of everyone present. "Dear guests, it is an honor to have you here tonight to celebrate the achievements of our foundation." He began with a smile that reflected pride. "However, before we continue, we would like to introduce you to someone very special, a person whose vision and dedication have transformed countless lives." Clara felt her heart racing. They must be talking about someone else, she thought as she tried to remain calm. Enrique, for his part, was sitting comfortably in his chair, one eyebrow raised in a gesture of slight curiosity. "Let me introduce you to Clara Martinez, the founder of this wonderful initiative." A deep silence filled the room for a moment, followed by surprised murmurs. Enrique blinked, stunned, as he watched Clara slowly rise from her seat, driven more by astonishment than by her own decision. The organizers invited her onto the stage with a kind gesture, and she advanced with hesitant steps, feeling every gaze on her like a tangible weight. On stage, Clara received the microphone with slightly trembling hands, but her face reflected a calm she did not fully feel. She took a breath before speaking. "Thank you," he began with a calm voice that resonated in the room. "The truth is, I never imagined that something that began as a small dream in my community could come this far." Her speech was brief but powerful, filled with gratitude and humility. She spoke about the foundation's origins, how it had begun with limited resources and the help of ordinary people who shared her vision. Her message resonated with sincerity, and the audience, even those who had looked down on her at the beginning, were forced to acknowledge her strength and dedication. In his seat, Enrique could barely process what had just happened. The woman he had belittled all night was, in fact, the mind behind the project he had donated generously to for years. A feeling of shame washed over him, but also something new: admiration. When Clara finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. The intensity of the cheers filled the room, and Clara, though overwhelmed, responded with a genuine smile. Back at his table, Enrique was still watching her, this time with a mixture of respect and regret. He had underestimated Clara, but now he couldn't help but be intrigued by her story. As the applause faded, the organizers took back the microphone to continue with the program, but the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. Clara was no longer an ignored or criticized figure. Now she was the center of admiration and respect. Enrique, still processing everything that had happened, knew he had to do something. Clara had completely transformed his perspective of the night, and he couldn't let this encounter end without correcting his mistakes. After the big reveal, Clara returned to her table, where Julia greeted her with an excited hug. Although Clara was smiling, she was struggling to come to terms with what had happened. The warmth of the applause still resonated in her ears, but she was also aware of the gazes that now followed her with renewed interest. A few meters away, Enrique stood motionless, his mind wrapped in a whirlwind of thoughts. For the first time in a long time, he felt a pang of shame that made him question his own attitudes. He had judged Clara without knowing her. He had assumed that her appearance and her background determined her worth. Now he knew he had been completely wrong. Without thinking twice, he stood up and walked towards Clara's table. Every step was a reminder of his arrogance and an opportunity to make amends. As he arrived, the murmurs in the room seemed to intensify. Enrique was not known for admitting mistakes, and his unexpected presence caught everyone's attention. Clara looked up, surprised to see him in front of her. Enrique took a breath and, to everyone's surprise, knelt down. "Miss Martinez," he began, in a voice that had lost all haughtiness, "I must sincerely apologize for my behavior this evening." The room fell silent. The guests looked at the scene in amazement, while Enrique continued. "I was arrogant, prejudiced, and deeply disrespectful towards you. And now, knowing your story and everything you have achieved, I can only feel admiration for your work and shame for my actions." Clara, still incredulous, watched him closely. There was something in his words, in his expression, that told her they were sincere. Although she might have relished the opportunity to reproach him, she opted for a response more in keeping with her nature. "I appreciate your words, Mr. Enrique," she said with a soft smile. "But I want you to know that it is not to me that you must show your regret, but to the people who need our support the most." Enrique nodded, understanding the message behind her words. "I will, I promise." Clara leaned slightly towards him and added, in a firm but kind tone, "The true value of a person is not measured by his wealth, but by what he does with it." Enrique looked at her for a few seconds, processing the depth of her words. Then he stood up and, with a respectful bow, returned to his seat. As he did so, the room erupted in spontaneous applause, not only for Clara, but also in recognition of the humility Enrique had just shown. The evening continued, but something had changed in the atmosphere. The guests seemed more aware, more thoughtful. Clara, though emotionally exhausted, felt that her message had gone further than she had expected. As Enrique walked back to his table, he knew that his apology was just the first step. There was so much more he could and should do. And deep down, he was beginning to see Clara not just as an inspiring leader, but as a person who had made him rethink what really mattered. The gala had reached its climax, but for Clara, the real event was happening inside her. Sitting next to Julia, she took a deep breath, allowing herself for the first time to relax the tension that had built up since the beginning of the evening. She looked around. The faces of the guests, now much less critical, seemed more open, even admiring. Julia looked at her with pride. "See? I knew you were supposed to come tonight." "Although I admit I didn't expect it to turn out this way," he said with an amused smile. Clara smiled back, though her eyes reflected the emotional exhaustion she felt. "It was difficult, Julia. At first I wanted to disappear. Every look, every comment made me feel like I shouldn't be here. But now I understand that it was worth it." Julia took her hand warmly. "It will always be worth it, Clara. Your story, your work. You inspire people, even those who will never admit it." As they spoke, Henrique sat at another table, silent with a glass of wine in his hand. He looked around the room, but his mind was occupied with thoughts that gave him no respite. For years, he had been surrounded by wealth and power, believing that that defined him. However, Clara, with her humility and strength, had shattered that perception in a single night. He turned to one of his partners, who was trying to start a conversation about investments. For the first time, Henrique found himself uninterested in those topics. His mind was focused on something much more meaningful: the people Clara helped and the real impact of her work. Back at Clara's table, Julia couldn't help but joke. "By the way, the sight of Henrique kneeling was something I never imagined I would witness." Clara let out a light laugh. "Neither do I, but I must admit that he was sincere. That has its merit." "Definitely. Although, if you ask me, I think he wasn't the only one impressed by your work." Clara raised an eyebrow, confused. "What do you mean?" Julia smiled mischievously. Nothing. It's just that the change in his attitude was noticeable." Clara shook her head, dismissing her friend's comment. To her, Henrique's transformation was proof that people could change if they were willing to open their hearts. As the lights began to dim and the organizers announced the end of the event, Clara looked at Julia and said quietly, "It was a difficult night, but I'm glad I came. If I learned anything today, it's that even in the most uncomfortable moments, there is room to transform the way people see the world." Julia nodded, wrapping her in a hug. "And that's what you've always done, Clara. This is just the beginning." Across the room, Henrique rose from his seat, determined. He looked at Clara one last time that night, realizing that she had left an indelible mark on his life. What came next would depend on his ability to act on the lessons learned. The morning after the event, Clara woke up with a sense of lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. Despite the intense emotions of the night before, there was something comforting in knowing that her story and her work had finally found an echo in those who had previously judged her. While having coffee with Julia in the modest but cozy kitchen of her house, the sound of the doorbell interrupted their conversation. Clara stood up, surprised. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she found Henrique standing there, holding a leather briefcase and with a calm but determined expression. "Good morning, Miss Martinez," he said in a respectful tone. "Could we talk for a moment?" Clara invited him in, though with a mixture of surprise and caution. Julia, always curious, gave them a knowing look before apologizing and leaving them alone. Henrique sat down in front of Clara, leaving the briefcase on the table. "I know last night was an intense experience for both of us. I want to thank you again for your patience and for accepting my apologies. But I also want to go further." Clara watched him silently, allowing him to continue. Henrique opened his briefcase and took out several documents, which he slid towards her. "I've been reflecting a lot since the event. Your work, your dedication, made me realize how much more I can do. That's why I want to propose a partnership with you." Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind of alliance?" "I want to help expand your foundation," Henrique replied with a conviction he had not shown before. "I can offer financial and logistical support, but under one condition: you will remain at the heart of this project." Clara looked at the documents in front of her. They were detailed proposals for new facilities, educational programs, and additional resources for the communities the foundation supported. The magnitude of what Henrique was offering was impressive, but it also raised a question in her mind. "I appreciate your generosity, But I need to make sure of one thing, he said calmly. This job is not about personal recognition or self-promotion. My priority will always be the people we help. If I accept your support, I want the focus to remain on them, not us. Henrique nodded, acknowledging the depth of her words. I totally understand. If I learned anything last night, it's that the real purpose of helping is not about prestige, but about impact. Clara thought for a moment before giving a slight smile. In that case, we have an agreement. The two shook hands, sealing a collaboration that promised to transform not only the foundation, but also the lives of those who needed it most. When Henrique got up to leave, he turned to Clara with a sincere smile. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I promise I won't let you down. Clara waved him goodbye. When she closed the door, she found Julia waiting for her with an inquisitive look. So what did Mr. Millionaire want? She asked with a mischievous smile. Clara laughed. Looks like we're going to have a new partner. Julia raised her eyebrows, impressed. Who would have imagined it? Clara sighed, feeling more motivated than ever. She knew that the alliance with Henrique would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. For the first time in a long time, she felt like her mission was reaching a scope she had never dreamed of. Weeks after the gala, the foundation was experiencing a rebirth. With Henrique's financial and logistical support, the projects began to expand beyond what Clara had imagined. New communities were joining the programs, and the positive impact was palpable. But despite the growth, Clara made sure to maintain the original spirit, focusing on people and their stories. That evening, a thank you event marked a new chapter for the foundation. In a simply decorated but warm community center, Clara was preparing to give a speech to volunteers, beneficiaries, and new allies. Henrique was there, next to Julia, watching from the side with an expression that mixed pride and respect. When Clara stepped onto the small makeshift stage, the audience fell silent. With a calm smile, she began to speak. When I started this project, I never thought it would take me this far. All I wanted was to help families in my community because I knew what it was like to face adversity. But one thing I have learned along the way is that true wealth is not in what we possess, but in what we share with others. The faces in the room reflected the depth of her words. Henrique, in particular, seemed especially moved. Clara's every word resonated with the lessons she had learned since that night at the gala. Today, we're not celebrating the resources we've raised or the numbers we've reached. We're celebrating the lives we've changed and the hope we've brought to those who need it most. Clara continued, her voice filled with emotion. And I want to thank every single person here, because without you, none of this would be possible. The audience burst into applause, some with tears in their eyes. Clara left the microphone and walked off the stage, surrounded by hugs and congratulations. Henrique approached her, extending a hand which she took with a smile. Every time I hear your words, I understand a little more what it means to live with purpose, Henrique said sincerely. Purpose doesn't have to be something grand, Clara replied. It's in every little action we do for others. Henrique nodded, understanding the truth behind those words. He looked around the room, seeing how people interacted, how the foundation had brought together so many different worlds. That evening ended with a collective toast. Clara raised her glass, surrounded by people who shared her vision. For the change we can achieve together, he said, and the voices around him repeated the phrase enthusiastically. As everyone began to leave, Henrique stayed a moment longer, watching Clara help clear away chairs and bid farewell to the last of the guests. He had changed, and he knew it. But more importantly, he had found something he had been searching for years, a purpose that would connect him to others. Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What kind of alliance? I want to help expand your foundation, Henrique replied with a conviction he had not shown before. I can offer financial and logistical support, but under one condition: you will remain at the heart of this project. Clara looked at the documents in front of her. They were detailed proposals for new facilities, educational programs, and additional resources for the communities the foundation supported. The magnitude of what Henrique was offering was impressive, but it also raised a question in her mind. I appreciate your generosity, but I need to make sure of one thing, he said calmly. This job is not about personal recognition or self-promotion. My priority will always be the people we help. If I accept your support, I want the focus to remain on them, not us." Henrique nodded, acknowledging the depth of her words. "I totally understand. If I learned anything last night, it's that the real purpose of helping is not about prestige, but about impact." Clara thought for a moment before giving a slight smile. "In that case, we have an agreement." The two shook hands, sealing a collaboration that promised to transform not only the foundation, but also the lives of those who needed it most. When Henrique got up to leave, he turned to Clara with a sincere smile. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I promise I won't let you down." Clara waved him goodbye. When she closed the door, she found Julia waiting for her with an inquisitive look. "So what did Mr. Millionaire want?" she asked with a mischievous smile. Clara laughed. "Looks like we're going to have a new partner." Julia raised her eyebrows, impressed. "Who would have imagined it?" Clara sighed, feeling more motivated than ever. She knew that the alliance with Henrique would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. For the first time in a long time, she felt like her mission was reaching a scope she had never dreamed of. Weeks after the gala, the foundation was experiencing a rebirth. With Henrique's financial and logistical support, the projects began to expand beyond what Clara had imagined. New communities were joining the programs, and the positive impact was palpable. But despite the growth, Clara made sure to maintain the original spirit, focusing on people and their stories. That evening, a thank you event marked a new chapter for the foundation. In a simply decorated but warm community center, Clara was preparing to give a speech to volunteers, beneficiaries, and new allies. Henrique was there, next to Julia, watching from the side with an expression that mixed pride and respect. When Clara stepped onto the small makeshift stage, the audience fell silent. With a calm smile, she began to speak. "When I started this project, I never thought it would take me this far. All I wanted was to help families in my community because I knew what it was like to face adversity. But one thing I have learned along the way is that true wealth is not in what we possess, but in what we share with others." The faces in the room reflected the depth of her words. Henrique, in particular, seemed especially moved. Clara's every word resonated with the lessons she had learned since that night at the gala. "Today, we're not celebrating the resources we've raised or the numbers we've reached. We're celebrating the lives we've changed and the hope we've brought to those who need it most," Clara continued, her voice filled with emotion. "And I want to thank every single person here, because without you, none of this would be possible." The audience burst into applause, some with tears in their eyes. Clara left the microphone and walked off the stage, surrounded by hugs and congratulations. Henrique approached her, extending a hand which she took with a smile. "Every time I hear your words, I understand a little more what it means to live with purpose," Henrique said sincerely. "Purpose doesn't have to be something grand," Clara replied. "It's in every little action we do for others." Henrique nodded, understanding the truth behind those words. He looked around the room, seeing how people interacted, how the foundation had brought together so many different worlds. That evening ended with a collective toast. Clara raised her glass, surrounded by people who shared her vision. "For the change we can achieve together," he said, and the voices around him repeated the phrase enthusiastically. As everyone began to leave, Henrique stayed a moment longer, watching Clara help clear away chairs and bid farewell to the last of the guests. He had changed, and he knew it. But more importantly, he had found something he had been searching for years, a purpose that would connect him to others. Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind of alliance?" "I want to help expand your foundation," Henrique replied with a conviction he had not shown before. "I can offer financial and logistical support, but under one condition: you will remain at the heart of this project." Clara looked at the documents in front of her. They were detailed proposals for new facilities, educational programs, and additional resources for the communities the foundation supported. The magnitude of what Henrique was offering was impressive, but it also raised a question in her mind. "I appreciate your generosity, but I need to make sure of one thing," he said calmly. "This job is not about personal recognition or self-promotion. My priority will always be the people we help. If I accept your support, I want the focus to remain on them, not us." Henrique nodded, acknowledging the depth of her words. "I totally understand. If I learned anything last night, it's that the real purpose of helping is not about prestige, but about impact." Clara thought for a moment before giving a slight smile. "In that case, we have an agreement." The two shook. As he left the community center, the moon lit the way, and Henrique allowed himself a smile. That night, he realized that while material wealth could open doors, it was the wealth of the soul that truly transformed lives. True wealth is not in what we possess, but in what we do with what we possess. We have. Clara teaches us that humility, courage, and purpose can transform even the hardest hearts. Now I ask you, how would you have reacted in his place? Would you have had the courage to stand firm in the face of the judgment of others? Or would you have let fear stop you? Click on the video that appears on your screen and continue this inspiring journey of self-knowledge and transformation. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this that inspire you to reflect and act. See you at the next video.